The Muppets, one of the greats in pop culture history. From commercials to television to movies, you couldn't go anywhere without seeing the felt creations of the legendary Jim Henson. Their earnest, clever humor and boundless creativity launched characters like Kermit the Frog, Miss Piggy, and Animal to actual superstardom, but sadly, it wouldn't last. Despite a number of attempts to revive the Muppets, they've since languished in the halls of Disney's seemingly forgotten properties, gathering dust while IPs like Marvel and Star Wars take the spotlight. Why is that the case, though? How did such a beloved franchise fall so far? And more importantly, who's to blame? Many people would say Disney themselves. And while they have their fair share of blame in the matter, I've found that the problem surprisingly goes much deeper than that. From a lack of creative vision after Jim's passing, to angry puppeteers, to an unwillingness to let go of the past in order to pave way for the future. The story of what's ruining the Muppets is far more complicated than you would think, and goes beyond just simply blaming Disney. Though with recent events at the theme parks, Muppet fans have yet another very valid reason to hate on the mouse. So join me as we explore what's ruining the Muppets. Our story begins with, I'm feeling kind of weird, almost like my skin's all fuzzy and felty. Oh, there we go. All better. Wait, can I do the Kermit the Frog hand things? Okay, kind of. Well, I tried. But real quick, I want to give a shout out to this video sponsor, Helix Sleep. This year has been quite the roller coaster, and I'm sure that you all have felt it. There's been plenty of days where I just don't want to leave my bed, and to be honest, I'm not sure whether that's because I'm feeling melancholy, or if it's just because my Helix mattress feels so freaking good. And that should go without saying, because Helix is still one of the leaders in premium mattresses tailored to your specific needs and shipped right to your doorstep with free shipping in the US. God bless America. Helix sends your mattress rolled up in a box right to your doorstep. Simply bring the box to your desired sleeping location, unbox it, then watch your mattress materialize right before your very eyes. Come on in right this way, and let Helix's tailors size you up for the mattress that is right for you. No need to measure your waist for the perfect fit. The Helix Sleep Quiz is designed to pair you up with the perfect mattress for you based on body type and sleep preferences. For me, it was the Midnight Luxe, and I've been super happy with it ever since I've laid my head down on it. I've had this mattress for over a year now, and its unparalleled comfort has really shed a light on how important it is to have the right mattress. Folks, we spend 30% of our lives sleeping, so it is truly one of the most important investments you could ever make. And with many mattresses to choose from, there's an option for everyone. There's the award-winning Luxe and Ultra Premium Elite collections, the Helix Plus for big and tall sleepers, and there's even the Helix Kids mattress designed to keep your kids snug in bed while Santa goes about his business. So if you're looking to invest in a better mattress for you or your loved ones, then there is nothing better than a Helix. Folks, we've been working with them for a long time now, and we believe in their mission to provide everyone with an unmatched sleeping experience. So click the link down below in the description box and use my code Saberspark to get 20% off your Helix mattress plus 2 pillows for free. And on that note, back to the video.
Are you turkeys quiet down in there so somebody can get some sleep?
Our story begins with the legend himself, Jim Henson. He was born on September 24th, 1936, in Greenville, Mississippi, to parents Paul and Elizabeth Henson. He was the younger sibling of 2 boys, and was raised in Christian Science, a religious movement that one could describe as culty, to put it lightly. But don't worry though, he eventually left the movement in his early 20s. Jim often described his family getting their first TV set as the biggest event of his adolescence. Jim always had a penchant for the arts, and he had a particular love for puppetry. This makes sense as the 1950s into the 1960s were a golden age of puppetry in American pop culture. Renowned performers like Edgar Bergen and Bill Baird, along with TV shows like Kukla, Fran, and Ollie, all featured memorable characters with a wry sense of humor and comedic timing that appealed to both children and adults. And in retrospect, you can definitely tell how much they influenced his future work. But his early years were not perfect. Jim's older brother, Paul Jr., tragically died in a car crash on April 15, 1956, at the age of 24. This loss would go on to have an immense impact on Jim's life. In the Disney Plus documentary, Idea Man, his children Brian and Cheryl Henson stated that his grief instilled a lingering anxiety about time and how quickly it could run out. It fueled his drive to work, but this effect became both a blessing and a curse. Jim would get his first taste for the entertainment industry while attending Northwestern High School, where he began working for WTOP-TV, creating puppets for a show called The Junior Morning Show. After his time with WTOP, Jim moved on to WRC-TV, Washington, D.C.'s NBC station, a place that Jim called home for the next 7 years, from 54 to 61. Jim was initially brought on to work on a show called Afternoon, a magazine show aimed at housewives. The show involved various segments about cooking or fashion, along with segments for kids that Jim would puppeteer on. It was on this show that Jim met Jane Nabel, who later became his wife and frequent collaborator. Jim and Jane were both college students at the time and loved goofing off and messing around. Hey, you gotta do something when you're not entertaining the children of women who are being sold like hair curlers and casserole dishes? I don't know what the 1950s were like. Instead, Jim and Jane made the puppets for Afternoon lip-sync to popular songs, or told jokes that were perhaps a little more edgy than you would see on a daytime puppet show. This caught the eye of station executives, who really liked what Jim and Jane were doing. At this point in history, TV was, for all intents and purposes, still a very young medium, so the people in charge were very much open to experimentation and taking chances. Gee, I wonder what that's like. We certainly don't live in times like those anymore. Jim and Jane were given a 5-minute show segment that would air twice, once before an evening news show called The Huntley-Brinkley Report, and as a lead-in before The Tonight Show, a talk show hosted by comedian Steve Allen, which aired at 11:30 p.m. Now, this might not seem like a big deal, considering we all have smartphones, and there's too many talk shows to count, but this was 1955. The news and talk shows were appointment viewing for so much of the country. Jim and Jane were essentially handed the widest possible audience on a silver platter. Once again, I wonder what that's like. Sam and Friends was made up of 5-minute episodes. Usually, it involved the puppets lip-syncing to popular songs of the period. And if the song was sung by a woman, they would put wigs on the puppets.
Wigs for sale! Wigs of all nations! Wigs for sale!
The roster of puppets included Sam, a bald talk show host-looking humanoid, Yorick, a purple skull rock thing, Professor Madcliffe, a sort of visual parody of Albert Einstein, and most importantly, the earliest form of Kermit, before he became a frog. At this point, he was like an ambiguous reptile-amphibian thing. We'll call him Proto-Kermit for short. Sam and Friends afforded Jim the chance to really familiarize himself with television production. He asked the tech crews at WRC-TV all kinds of questions about what they were doing on the job, and they were happy to teach him because he was an incredibly curious person who genuinely wanted to learn. Jim took on that knowledge and applied it to Sam and Friends, wanting to make it the best show that he possibly could. Sam and Friends proved to be a great proving ground for Jim, as it was where he would get paid to essentially figure things out and develop processes he would later carry on into his other work. He improved his puppet crafting skills, studied set designs, developed his performance skills even further, and truly invested himself into the TV format. Jim did not simply want to make a puppet show, which were typically shot on stage and meant to imitate a theater performance. He wanted to fully take advantage of the medium of television and what a show tailored for TV could be. In many ways, Jim actually sounds like the early group of YouTubers who truly broke ground on the platform. Much like how they realized that internet video wasn't just copying movies or TV, but creating something new altogether. Jim had similar thoughts about TV at the time. Jim had a do-it-yourself attitude and touched many parts of a production that gave him his own unique style. Now, it's hard to find exact rating numbers for Sam and Friends. Many of the episodes weren't archived properly, and sadly have been lost to time for decades. But it ran from May 1955 to December 1961. The Muppets were firmly cemented as a pop culture craze, as their popularity would continue to rise, along with Jim's notability as a creator. In 1957, while work was still being done on Sam and Friends, Jim began doing commercial work with puppets as well. In fact, many of these commercials would star characters from Sam and Friends and mark the appearances of the earliest forms of famous Muppets today, such as Cookie the Monster and Rolf. But the most famous of these commercials were easily the Wilkins coffee commercials. These ads starred two Muppets named Wilkins and Wonkins, and typically involved a similar setup and payoff. Wilkins suggesting that Wonkins should try a cup of Wilkins coffee. Wonkins would grumpily refuse, only to then go on and get absolutely obliterated by Wilkins, like a la Jackass style. Jim's approach to selling was to make people laugh in relation to the product, rather than driving home the hard sell. In a sea of commercials that all felt the same, these coffee ads felt fresh and original.
Okay, William, tell us, better be good.
Do you drink Wilkins coffee?
No.
We can still use the apple again.
Not to mention highly profitable. Wilkins would go on to commission more than 300 commercials from Jim. After finishing his run with Wilkins, Jim was on top of the world. He had a successful commercial business under his belt, along with Sam and Friends, making regular appearances on programs like Today and The Tonight Show. He had a thriving business and a family. He was living the American dream. Sam the Eagle approved, right? But if you know any creative people, then you know that's not enough. Jim wanted more. In 1960, Jim met a guy named Frank Oz at the Puppeteers of America Festival. Little did he know that Frank would later become his longtime collaborator and close friend. If by some insane chance you don't know who Frank Oz is, you certainly know the characters he helped breathe life into. Miss Piggy, Fozzie the Bear, Animal, Sam the Eagle, Bert, Cookie Monster, Grover, and of course, freaking Yoda. I cannot stress enough that this is just a small selection of his work, and we haven't even gotten into his work as a director. This is also when Jim would start working with Don Salim, who, in Jim's own words, was, quote, the man most responsible for the look of the Muppets. Don had a unique ability, according to Jim. He knew how to take Jim's zany designs and interpret them in a way where they could be easily made real. Salim was responsible for the simple but zany and abstract forms we associate with the Muppets. Salim helped Jim construct Rolf the dog. Originally created for Purina dog food commercials, Rolf became the first Muppet to really be launched to national stardom. I'm sorry, every time I talk about a Muppet character as a star and not their performer, I can't help but laugh a little. It's incredibly endearing, but it almost feels the same as when people talk about their favorite VTubers. Oh no, what would Jim have to say about Holo Live? Actually, wait, are the Muppets just proto-VTubers?
To be dead silent, you just want Christmas carols playing. Christmas carols for everyone! Oh my god, do you think some people have a fetish of like when they want to folk during Christmas and they want a Christmas carol to play? They want Christmas carols to play the whole time. Is that a fetish? I need to know!
Anyway, along with dog food commercials, Rolf would have a regular stint on The Jimmy Dean Show. Yes, the same country singer behind the Breakfast Sausage Company. Rolf and Jimmy would exchange banter and jokes, but also sing together occasionally. It was on this show that Henson developed what could easily be considered his most important skill: working and interacting with human performers while in character. Jim worked with the writers of the show to learn how to craft jokes and deliver punchlines. The variety show nature of the Jimmy Dean Show helped him get familiar with various entertainment formats and how to package them into one seamless experience. He combined those new skills with his more irreverent style of humor he did on Sam and Friends to create the style of humor we know the Muppets best for today. By the time the Jimmy Dean Show ended, Rolf wasn't just a recurring character. He was a full-blown star in his own right. The work Jim and the writers did to establish the character would even result in Rolf getting his own fan mail. However, something changed in the late 1960s as Jim began to fall out of love with puppetry, which seems unthinkable to fans now. But around this time, he had been getting more into experimental film and started laying the groundwork for a series of sensory experience-themed nightclubs. But with TV exploding as a medium and kids starting to watch hours and hours of it, there was a growing concern that not everything made for children was necessarily good for children. In 1968, an American nonprofit organization called the Action for Children's Television, or ACT for short, began doing studies to improve the quality of children's TV, specifically regarding how many ads were put into kids' programming, including long-running hit TV shows like Romper Room. They spent years researching the impact of advertising on children's perception and discovered that most kids under 9 straight up could not tell the difference between entertainment and an advertisement. With their findings, ACT contacted the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, asking them to implement new restrictions to protect children from the impact of ads. Their conditions were pretty straightforward, wanting 14 hours of programming for kids through the whole week, no ads during child-oriented shows, and the TV personalities cannot sell products to their audience. This led to an advocacy group called the Children's Television Workshop that made it their goal to improve children's programming in an impactful way. They gathered the who's who of television experts at the time, with the goal of combining what they knew about TV with what the workshop knew about educating kids. And you guessed it, Jim was part of that panel. Now, Jim was actually very hesitant to make a new show, let alone one geared towards children. On one hand, he knew the value it could have, as his own children were more or less in the target age range for one. Additionally, his son John had learning disabilities and was still nonverbal, and a TV show could be a tremendous resource to other kids like John, who needed additional guidance with learning. At the same time, though, Jim did not really view himself as an educator and was hesitant to take charge on something so vital. But one of the founders of the Children's Television Workshop, Joan Gans Cooney, knew that Jim's careful nature and intelligent writing style would be one of the best approaches to reframe the turbulence of the late 1960s for a younger audience. Joan remarked, quote, "It was at this time that Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were killed, and I think that affected many people, including Jim. There was a feeling in the air that something had to be done. And while the show was not aimed solely at poor children or inner-city children, they were the bull's eye of the target. I don't think Jim was particularly involved in social issues. We never discussed them. But like others who came aboard at that period, he was certainly responding to the prevailing social culture." End quote. Jim was finally convinced to do it when the opportunity was pitched to him as a chance to make a series of experimental short films, rather than a strictly educational program. With that, Sesame Street was developed and premiered on November 10th, 1969. Jim and co. would focus on making the show funny, cool, and experimental, trusting that through this approach, the educational aspects would fall into place. The result would see Sesame Street not only fulfilling its role as an educational program, but elevated it to an amazing piece of counterculture programming at the time. It represented the possibilities of children's programming when the people making it behind the scenes genuinely cared about their audience. Sesame Street was an instant hit and would launch Jim Henson and the Muppets into national stardom. Muppets Inc. would expand considerably, bringing on all sorts of new talent. But with the eyes of America's youth on him, Jim was beginning to feel boxed in. As Sesame Street's popularity began to grow, Jim was being looked to as some sort of preschool educator for America's children. It was something that made him deeply uncomfortable. After all, this is a man that contained many multitudes and wanted to do so much that wasn't just kid stuff. In fact, even before Sesame Street, Jim had an idea for a Muppet-led variety show, but was having a hard time getting it sold because networks didn't believe adults would tune in for a late-night style show led by a bunch of puppets. In an attempt to convince studio heads, Jim got himself a slot on a small upstart show called Saturday Night Live on NBC to prove that the Muppets could appeal to an older crowd of late-night audiences. However, Jim's time on SNL was not a happy time in his life. For one, Jim and the other puppeteers from Muppet Inc. were not allowed to write their own material. So instead of being creative themselves, they were just sort of parroting other people's jokes. Secondly, a lot of the writers on SNL just plain did not like the idea of puppets on their show and had a hostile attitude towards Jim and his crew. But it was during this time on SNL that Jim and the Muppets would meet their savior, a man by the name of Lew Grade. Lew Grade was a British television executive who, much like Jim, saw the great potential in TV as a medium. Lew's approach to the business was to produce shows and programming in England, then get it aired in America as well, to cash in twice. Lew noticed that the Muppets had made a lot of appearances in other shows, and, of course, had their own show with Sesame Street, but were having a hard time branching out further. Lew got in contact with Jim, convincing him to shoot the Muppets-led variety show in the studios in Elstree, Hertfordshire, and would let Jim syndicate the show internationally. Lew, a former Charleston dancer himself, believed in good and unique programming, as he saw a lot of himself in the Muppets and in Jim. In an article with The Telegraph written by Michael Hogan, Lew's niece, Anita Land, remarked on her uncle's relationship to the Muppets, saying, quote, "The Muppets appealed to him on every level. It was transatlantic. It was for families. It was funny. It had music, dance, and big stars. Out of all of his many programs, it sums up Uncle Lew's approach to TV best." End quote. The Muppet Show premiered on September 5th, 1976, and quickly became a massive hit, with the series establishing so much of what we all love about the Muppets as characters. Kermit the Frog as a well-meaning but exhausted host, trying to hold it all together. The folding in of celebrity guests. The dynamics of Miss Piggy and Kermit as a tumultuous on-again, off-again couple. One could argue that while, yes, the Muppets had existed up until this point, it wasn't until this very special show that they would truly come of age and figure out who they were. The Muppet Show was a well-crafted blend of clever, but not mean-spirited humor that became so popular that they'd actually have to turn away celebrity guests that wanted to be on the show. They simply did not have enough episodes in a season to have them on. The heart of the show involved a strong sense of camaraderie between the performers, the crew, and the guest stars. Much of the day-to-day logistics were handled by executive producer David Laser. Jim noted just how many hats he had to wear, handling finances, union disputes, and communicating directly with guests. He remarked, quote, "The kind of comedy we do depends on being able to work in a certain atmosphere. It's something we strive consciously to create. I've heard of other shows that thrive on the tension that exists between the stars, or between a star and the producers, but that would not work for us. If we didn't manage to maintain a friendly atmosphere, we'd be in deep trouble. Executive producer David Laser is the person we rely on." End quote. The Muppet Show would go on to air in 100 countries, and for its time, be the most viewed TV show in history. If you want an idea of how beloved the Muppets were at this time, I highly suggest you check out any interviews Jim or the Muppets did with Orson Welles. And yes, I mean Citizen Kane and War of the Worlds star Orson Welles. He's a known grump and highly opinionated, but Orson was totally infatuated by the Muppets, and it's such a joy to watch.
I'm preparing. This is bare meditation.
It's a little like the Stanislavski method.
Well, it's the gang's Beasley method. You just say, "Please let me be funny."
As the Muppets' meteoric TV rise was happening, Jim decided that wasn't the only screen he wanted to conquer. Outside of working on the show, Jim began taking charge on an even bigger project, a movie, The Muppet Movie. The Muppet Movie was written by Jerry Jewell and Jack Burns, directed by James Frawley, and financed by Lou Grade and produced by Jim Henson. In many ways, everything had been leading to this point. Not only were the Muppets interacting with guest stars, they were interacting with the world at large, as much of the movie was shot on location. They were in cars, a scenic bike ride, or yes, even a swamp. The Muppets had officially left the studio. Originally released in the UK on May 31st, 1979, The Muppet Movie was a massive hit, bringing in $65 million at the box office on an $8 million budget, and in subsequent years would bring in another $32 million in rentals. In fact, until the release of 2011's The Muppets, it was the highest-grossing Muppet movie ever. It was also a critical darling, too, due to its broad appeal for people of all ages, the punchiness of the script, and of course, the incredible music. The soundtrack was nominated for both Best Score and Best Song for Rainbow Connection at the 1980 Academy Awards. The Muppets have a very storied cinematic history, but we don't have the time in this already very long script to do breakdowns of all of them. But I want to give a special shout out to The Great Muppet Caper, The Muppets Take Manhattan, and Muppet Treasure Island. All fantastic movies that I cannot recommend enough. And while never quite reaching the box office heights of the original film, they all did really well relative to their modest budgets. Go figure. When you're not spending a bajillion dollars on a movie, it's possible to keep even modestly sized franchises going. Hey Disney, over here, listen to my little puppet hands. Somehow snap. Are you listening? Modest budget, keeping the franchise going. Yeah? Catch that? Good. By 1980, Jim wasn't just burning the candle at both ends. He was taking a blowtorch to it. Sesame Street, The Muppet Show, The Muppet Movie all blew up in consecutive fashion, launching Jim and Muppet Inc. into rock star territory. He was shooting The Muppet Show in England, running the day-to-day of Muppets Inc. in New York City, was still dedicated to Sesame Street, and of course had his family to worry about as well. Collaborators like Frank Oz, and even his own children recall how during the one day off he'd get a week, he would always be sick from how worn down he was. That he would spend the whole day collapsed, only to have to wake up the next day and start the 6-day grind all over again. To Jim's credit, he did not let the success get to his head either. While it would have been easy for most to rest on their laurels and repeat their greatest hits over and over again while the money rolls in, Jim had other things in mind. He wanted to go on his next creative quest, and doing The Muppet Show wasn't conducive to that. So, he decided that Season 5 would be the final season. Folks, I really need to address how both admirable and crazy this move was. On one hand, there's a lot of credit to be given for being able to preemptively see when you're phoning it in, and deciding to stop before then, to maintain the integrity of what it is you're working on. For instance, I'm a huge Arrested Development fan, but my enjoyment of the show as a whole definitely was shaken when the Netflix seasons began coming out, and the quality was not up to that of the original 3. While some episodes are funny, it's definitely a stain on what I used to consider a perfect record. Or consider The Simpsons, a show that at the time of writing this has been going on for 35 seasons. In those early years, The Simpsons was widely considered a perfect show. But it has been unbelievably mid for so long that it's basically overtaken the conversation about the show. Jim did not want that to happen to The Muppet Show, and I consider that pretty noble. On the other hand, the ratings of The Muppet Show were amazing, and most shows would kill for that kind of sustained viewership. Sure, things are not a guarantee in show business, and Jim had about the closest you could get to one. So it's not hard to think, wow, this guy's crazy for wanting to end it, especially when you consider the amount of people that the show employed. The Muppet Show would air its final season on March 15th, 1981. Ending a legendary 5-season run that took the world by storm. Given the trials and tribulations that happened post-ending The Muppet Show, I often wonder if Jim regretted ending it when he did. I wholeheartedly think doing the show and the other creative projects he wanted to explore would have been impossible. But in doing my research for this video, I can't help but wonder if something stable to rely on for revenue would have been a boon, so that when things like Labyrinth disappointed both critically and commercially, it wouldn't be nearly as devastating. Jim continued to have a storied career after the ending of The Muppet Show. The Dark Crystal, Labyrinth, establishing the Creature Shop, and Fraggle Rock, to name a few. But in order to keep this video Muppets focused, i.e. Kermit, Miss Piggy, Fozzie, etc., we're going to skip around and focus on the 3 main issues involving Jim that affected their legacy for the worse. Number 1, Jim buying The Muppet Show and the Muppet movies back. 2, the sale of the Muppets to Disney. And 3, Jim's intense workaholic personality and how that affected his health. In the mid-1980s, Lou Grade would sell his production company to another company named Marble Arch. This would mean that The Muppet Show, The Muppets movies, and The Dark Crystal would all be owned by people that Jim did not know. And this did not sit well with him. Jim made arguably the biggest gamble of his life and mortgaged everything he could in order to buy his projects back. It's important to note that this decision was after Labyrinth had bombed at the box office, meaning it was probably more than a bit risky to be playing around with money and assets like that. Labyrinth may be considered a cult classic now for fantasy nerds and David Bowie fans alike, but during the initial US release, it only made around $13 million against a $25 million budget. After the failure of Labyrinth, Jim felt like for the very first time, the public had turned their back on him. But rather than dwell on that for too long, he decided to get back to doing what he did best, creating. During this time, he was focused on getting new projects off the ground, such as Fraggle Rock and The Storyteller. Jim was also even exploring the early stages of mocap to see how he could possibly blend CG with puppetry. With this newfound wind of creative energy under his wings, Jim decided it was time to sell the Muppets. At this point, the Muppets weren't just a group of characters. They were an entertainment entity. And any commercial entity that big comes with a lot of moving parts: merchandising, licensing, rights management, all the boring parts of running a media empire. Jim was involved in all of that, including production. The only problem is that Jim was not a businessman. It really seems like he was involved in those other aspects more so out of necessity and duty to the characters, rather than out of actual desire. At least that was the vibe I got from it during my research. So in the early 1990s, he entered into a gentleman's agreement with the then Disney CEO Michael Eisner to sell the Muppets to the Walt Disney Company. Eisner also wanted to buy Sesame Street in the same deal, but that was a no-go for Jim. Given the educational aspect of Sesame Street, and that it aired on a publicly funded network like PBS, it was important that Sesame Street stayed where it was. It was for the people. Which makes the fact that it's now broadcast by Overlord Zaslav and HBO even sadder. But I digress. The idea was that Disney was a large enough company between the theme parks and movies that they could handle the day-to-day business stuff so that Jim could focus on creating. There was also the added benefit that Jim was a huge Disney World fan, or at least according to his kids. And it makes sense when you think about it. Disney theme parks are renowned for their environmental storytelling and immersion. They're the kind of places we can go and have fun on a surface level, enjoying the rides and pretty sights. But if you want to observe deeper, you can almost certainly find an ongoing narrative happening in any given attraction. This was especially true in the 1990s, when the parks were much less filled with established IP, and instead filled with more park-specific experiences. So it's no wonder that an experimental storyteller like Jim was drawn to a place where the narrative could actually be an immersive, lived-in experience. Disney was putting priority on that approach at the time, and it made the company an appealing home for the Muppets from Jim's perspective. Michael Eisner led the charge in the acquisition of the Jim Henson Company. While there is much to criticize Eisner for, and rest assured, we'll get to that here in a bit, he did seem wholly dedicated to integrating the Muppets into Disney canon. Even before a deal was finalized, Eisner and Jim had big plans for the Muppets. There was the live stage show at the parks, Here Come the Muppets, the all-time classic Muppet Vision 3D, But the biggest draw of them all was a plan to create a Muppet Studios, their own designated section of the park within Disney MGM Studios, which is now today known as Hollywood Studios. The land was set to be presented as the backlot, where the Muppets made all their movies. It would have attractions like Muppet Vision 3D and the Great Muppet Movie Ride, Swedish Chef's Cooking School, an immersive show where the Swedish chef battles ingredients to make a meal, and dining experiences like the Great Gonzo's Pizza Pandemonium Parlor. It was to be a fully immersive Muppet paradise, the kind of place where anyone, not just celebrities, would get their Muppet moment. It would have been a dream come true for Jim. Sadly, it would never come to pass. On May 4th, 1990, Jim appeared on the Arsenio Hall show with Kermit. After the recording, he confided in his publicist that he was dealing with a sore throat. But with the Disney deal ongoing, Muppets projects in the works, and a trip scheduled to visit his parents, Jim did what he always did. He powered through. On the trip to visit his parents in North Carolina, Jim was struggling to get himself out of bed. His family decided to just let him rest, thinking he was just worn down and exhausted from a busy few months of work. Eventually, they get a flight back home to New York City. Back home in New York, Jim canceled a Muppets recording session that was scheduled for the following day. This was concerning to Cheryl Henson, Jim's daughter, because her father never canceled, even when sick. On the late evening of May 14th, 1990, Cheryl, her brother Johnny, and Jim's ex-wife Jane gathered together to be with him. Jim and Jane had been separated for 4 years, but there was still an incredible love between the two of them. At 2 a.m., Jim began to cough up blood. By 4 a.m., they had taken him to the hospital. By the time Jim had been admitted to the hospital, pockets of infection throughout his body were causing it to shut down. And tragically, on May 16, 1990, Jim Henson passed away at 1:21 a.m. He was 53 years old. The cause of death was toxic shock syndrome, caused by Streptococcus pyogenes. Now, I want to take a quick break from the video to address anyone watching that might be a creative type. Whether you're an artist, a writer, or even a fellow content creator, this message is for you. I know that our work can be all-consuming. It's easy to lose yourself in your work, especially when it's something that you're passionate about. But please, remember to take breaks. When you're sick, make sure to rest. When your brain is feeling fried, give it a break. Just make sure to take care of yourself. I respect Jim Henson's work ethic so much. The Muppets would not be what it is today without his Herculean efforts to make it special. But it's hard not to be sad or think about how much more he could have made if he would have slowed down or just leaned on others more. For as much as you may love your work, remember, at the end of the day, none of the work is as important as you are to the people that love you. Please take care of yourselves. Jim had 2 memorials. One was held at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine on May 21st, 1990, and another in London on July 2nd, 1990. The New York memorial was recorded in its entirety. Jim left a detailed guide on how he wanted his service to be run, including a request that no one would wear black and that there would be a jazz band present. The whole thing was filled with music, dancing, and of course, Muppets. Various performers took to the stage to sing Jim's favorite songs in memory of him. The most famous of these from the service is Carol Spinney as Big Bird, singing "It's Not Easy Being Green." You can hear him begin to get choked up during the song. In that moment, you realize this isn't just a loss for those who knew him. It's also a loss for the characters he helped to create as well. It is one of the most beautiful and touching memorials I think I've ever seen. And to this day, anytime I watch a video of the service, I can't help but start to tear up.
It's beautiful, and I think it's what I want to be.
Jim's death was a profound loss for both his colleagues and his fans around the world. But it also complicated things revolving around the pending deal with Disney. The Muppets were valued between $100 to $150 million based on Disney's original offer, per an article by Michael White from the Washington Post. In Michael Eisner's mind, he wasn't just buying the Muppets, he was also hiring Jim Henson. This was seen as a huge boon for the company, especially given that Jim was expected to be highly involved and all of the planned Muppet projects that Disney expected to pull off. So when it was time to return to the negotiating table, Disney returned with a lower offer that did not go over well. The two sides negotiated for 18 months, ultimately decided to go their separate ways. Now, this would not be a total loss, as there were a number of projects that Disney and the Muppets would pull off together, including a Muppet Christmas Carol, Muppet Treasure Island, and of course, Muppet Vision 3D, which is the last of the Muppet projects that Jim would direct himself. The Jim Henson Company was eventually sold to EMTV and Merchandising AG, a Munich-based media company that had done business with the Jim Henson Company for years. The Henson Company was acquired for $680 million in February of 2000. It is very important to note that this did not just include the Muppets. It was just about everything the company had touched, including Sesame Street, Fraggle Rock, Dark Crystal, and Labyrinth, to name a few. However, after a series of incredibly pricey acquisitions, EM's stock price would begin to tank. The Sesame Street Muppet characters were sold off to Sesame Workshop, previously the Children's Television Workshop, and the Jim Henson Company were sold back to the Henson family for $89 million. A year later, on February 17, 2004, the Henson family would finally, 14 years after the initial talks, sell the Muppets to Disney for $75 million. The deal included much of the Muppets film and TV library, as well as rights to the preschool series the Henson Company produced for Disney Channel, which was Bear in the Big Blue House. Only this was a very different Disney with very different leadership, and the Muppets without a captain at the helm.
I'm starting to worry about this voyage.
So you're probably asking yourself, hey Saber, why did you have an almost documentary-length opening to this video about what's ruining the Muppets? Just say it already. And the answer to that question is that I really needed you all to fully understand just how integral Jim was to the Muppets, how entirely wrapped up in his work he was, and how the identity of the property was so tied to him. In some ways, this was a blessing. The quality of the work speaks for itself. But in other ways, it seems like Jim's DNA was practically ingrained into the wild success of the Muppets. And his passing was just the first domino that gets us to where we are today. If you ask most Muppet fans what's ruining the Muppets, they'll give you the easy, low-hanging fruit answer. Disney is ruining the Muppets.
And now, dipping Pizza Hut's new Dip and Strips pizza, the Great Gonzo!
And while yes, Disney has their fair share of the blame in this scenario, and we'll get into that here in a bit, I think that's sort of a cop-out answer. Disney may have had several mishaps involving the Muppets, but they're not the only ones to blame. In fact, they're just one of many reasons things got this out of control. Let's get into some of the other factors involved first. Number 1, no succession plan. One of the first things that I believe is ruining the Muppets is the lack of a succession plan in place in the event that Jim passed away. As I brought up before, Jim really was the ringleader for this felt and ping-pong ball-eyed circus. And without him, I feel like no one really knew what to do. In theory, when you have a succession plan in place, it makes passing the reins to the person taking over easier. That person knows what they're stepping into and has had the proper training needed to keep things moving from there. Brian Henson was named president, chairman, and CEO in 1991, with the thought that keeping things in the family was the best way to preserve the Henson legacy. Now, to his credit, Brian did do some amazing work during that time, including directing arguably 2 of the best Muppet movies, The Muppet Christmas Carol and Muppet Treasure Island. But being a director and running a studio are 2 very different skill sets, especially considering Brian was only 26 at the time. Now, from what I've read and watched covering Jim's relationship to his kids, one thing that was really evident was that he never really pressured them to follow in his footsteps. If they happened to take an interest in puppeteering or filmmaking, he encouraged it. But there was never a predetermined path laid out for them. Which, hey, that's a good thing. No one wants to be pressured to do something they don't want. I have to imagine that's extra true if the thing theoretically being forced on you is following in your legendary father's footsteps. Unfortunately, that meant with Jim's sudden passing, his children were sort of forced into that position by other people in the company to take over. And Brian, being the dutiful son, stepped up to the plate. In a piece for Ain't It Cool News, published in March 2004, writer Jim Hill reports that according to some people close to the situation, Brian never exactly wanted that though. He never wanted to be a CEO or to oversee guardianship of the Muppets, but that's what he would find himself doing for the next 14 years. Now, I want to note that while Jim Hill has been reporting on Disney news for decades, that this is very much so a he said, she said. So we will never know for sure. But given the suddenness with which Jim died, and how we know for a fact he encouraged his kids to be their own people, it's not that hard to believe. As far as Jim and his family knew, he'd be leading the company for another couple decades. So you've got a company with no real succession plan, with someone filling in the role out of obligation. And it's no wonder why the Jim Henson Company felt adrift after the founding member was gone. With that in mind, it's easy to see why Brian made some tough decisions along with the help from his sister, Lisa Henson, including selling the Muppets to EM.TV and later to Disney. At least in those two scenarios, especially in the case of Disney, there was a sense of corporate structure where not only would the characters be safeguarded, but there would be a chain of command to oversee business operations. Now, I want to be clear that this is in no way meant to be shade directed at Brian, Lisa, or any of the Henson children. They were faced with an impossible task, and in many ways, it seems like they were figuring things out as they went along. I think in selling the Muppets to Disney, they saw an opportunity to trust a huge obligation to a company they had a previous history with, that they were never quite ready to handle themselves. And it's important to note that while they no longer own the Muppets, the Henson children still operate the Henson Company to this day, and keep Jim's legacy alive in other ways, like with 2019's The Dark Crystal, Age of Resistance. Hey, Netflix, I'm never going to forgive you for canceling that. And also Fraggle Rock, Back to the Rock. How dare you?
Bloopy, wait, this cave is great. Let us. I'm so sorry.
And then we get to point number 2, a tale of two CEOs. Now, like I said, Disney has their fair share of blame in the status of the Muppets today. After acquiring them in 2004, Disney basically kept them as a dormant property for years. Sure, there was the Muppets Wizard of Oz, an overwhelmingly made-for-TV special, and the Muppets covering Bohemian Rhapsody, which was an incredibly charming but a quickly digestible music video that most people moved on from fairly quickly. So, what happened? The answer is equal parts annoying and very petty. Remember the former Disney CEO I brought up, Michael Eisner? He really led the charge to purchase the Muppets from Jim Henson. Eisner had actually worked with Jim in the 70s, back when Eisner was the head of ABC, and aired the specials, The Muppets Valentine Show, and The Muppet Show, Sex and Violence. I brought it up before, but there are a lot of things to critique Eisner for. His very public feud with Jeffrey Katzenberg, his over-eagerness to expand the theme parks globally, a string of box office flops, and of course, his other very public feud with Steve Jobs. At the time, Steve Jobs was CEO of Pixar, and things between them got so heated that Pixar nearly broke their business arrangement with Disney. Eisner was 100% a mixed bag CEO, but what I will give him credit for is having a certain crazy person energy that I think a company like Disney needs creatively. I think that's why he was so drawn to the Muppets. The Muppets represented something cool and irreverent, which was something Eisner was really looking for. If you know anything about his approach to the theme parks, you'll know that Eisner often leaned on the opinions of his teenage son to guide his views on what was cool, and I think the Muppets represented that to him. However, Eisner would get ousted from Disney in 2005, a year after overseeing the purchase of the Muppets, with Bob Iger taking over for his first term as Disney's new CEO. So, why did this leadership shakeup result in the Muppets being thrown in a broom closet and being forgotten? Well, to put it simply, Bob Iger never really liked the Muppets. In an article for Vanity Fair, writer Drew Taylor reports the state of the Muppets, detailing that while Bob was the president of Disney, he wasn't crazy about Eisner's purchase of the Muppets. Jim Henson historian and author Brian J. Jones was quoted in an article viewing Iger's relationship with the Muppets as a one forged out of obligation rather than love, stating, quote, Iger is so interested in Marvel and Star Wars because these are the kids he brought to the table. The Muppets came in under somebody else's watch, end quote. So, cut to 2005. Bob Iger is now at the helm, and he seemingly views the Muppets as excess baggage from former leadership. Bob Iger would instead set his eyes on his own goals by going on a spending spree, including buying Pixar, Marvel, and Lucasfilm during his original tenure, all acquisitions that he could take credit for, and that were more or less proven IP. The Muppets, meanwhile, were a property that needed some massaging in order to bring them into the modern day. But that was not something Iger was interested in doing, which is incredibly sad when you think about it. Because I would argue one of the things Disney is really good at doing is keeping their old IP alive over generations. You know, Uncanny Valley remakes notwithstanding, Disney should have been a perfect home for the Muppets. Merchandising opportunities, video games, theme park experiences. What's not to like? I think Iger's indifference, or disdain depending on who you're talking to, is most evident in where they were placed under Disney's corporate umbrella. In 2006, the Muppets were moved from, consumer products to Walt Disney Studios? Okay, sure. I don't know why they were there to begin with, or why it took 2 years to get them under the film wing. But hey, fine, better late than never. Well, it turns out no executives in Walt Disney Studios wanted to take on oversight, so they were then moved again to the Special Events Group. Then, in 2014, they were moved to Disney's Consumer Products and Interactive Media Group, the company division responsible for toys and video games. That group would then get folded into Disney Parks, Experiences, and Products in March of 2019. All the while, the Muppets are just sort of being passed around like the snot-nosed annoying little cousin that none of the older cousins want to hang out with at the family reunion. I will say that while I think the Muppets should be under Walt Disney Studios or Disney Television Studios, where they can be properly used for the mediums they were meant for, the current duo managing them appear to be a good fit for the brand. David Lightbody is Senior VP of Disney Live Entertainment for theme parks and theaters, and Lee Slaughter is VP of Muppet Studio and Live Character Strategy for Walt Disney Imagineering. Now, they haven't held these positions for very long, so they haven't had the chance to really make their mark. But Lee is credited as a producer on the charming Muppets Haunted Mansion and the sort of The Muppets Mayhem. But even with two executives attached to them who hopefully care about the brand, I can't help but feel the Muppets are not being given their due when they aren't wrapped up in their film or TV branches of the company, where people with specific skill sets tailored to those mediums can use the proper resources to get the characters out there the way they're meant to be seen. I think the two CEOs' feelings on the Muppets are most evident when you look for pictures of them with the characters. Leading up to the acquisitions, Eisner could be seen in multiple pictures and videos with either the Muppets themselves or, in the case of announcing the sale, with Jim Henson. Maybe it was for bragging rights from a capitalist standpoint, or maybe it was out of genuine excitement for telling new stories. That's still out for debate. But the fact of the matter is that Eisner was proud to be seen with the Muppets. Instead, when you look for pictures or videos of Bob Iger with them, well, there aren't a whole lot. Not even in 2011 when Disney produced a series reboot film simply called The Muppets, despite that movie being a massive success. The most I've been able to find are some pictures with Kermit and Miss Piggy from a promotional event for Disney's Give a Day, Get a Day volunteer campaign. Bob Iger is all over the place in promo photos for Marvel or Lucasfilm events. But suddenly, once the Muppets are involved, he's nowhere to be found. Now, to Disney's credit, there have been some good, honest-to-God efforts to breathe life into the franchise. Not very many of them, but it's something. The most obvious and most successful was Muppets 2011, starring Jason Segel, who also wrote the movie, Amy Adams, and directed by James Bobin. It was a massive success both critically and commercially, making $165 million against a $45 million budget. Jason Segel is a huge Muppet fan himself and really imbued the script with a lot of meta commentary about how forgotten the Muppets have become.
Anyway, Welcome to the original Muppet Studio, where dreams can come true.
Is this the Universal Studios?
Yes, it is.
And the music is so clever and catchy. In fact, Man or Muppet would go on to win the Best Original Song at the 84th Academy Awards. The success of the film would go on to lead to a 2014 sequel, Muppets Most Wanted, and a 2015 TV series for ABC called The Muppets. So, all should be well, right? Personally, I don't think Disney ever really believed in Jason Segel's Muppet movie. At least, not as much as they should have. They may have known they had a good movie, but I don't think they were prepared for just how good it was, and how much audiences would respond to it. So when Muppets 2011 came out, and people wanted more, they were scrambling to catch up and give it to them. The problem is that movies and TV shows take a while to make. And so when Most Wanted, and especially the TV show, had come out, well, the hype had died down and people had moved on. I think if Disney had put more faith into the 2011 movie, they would have been quicker to respond and have other Muppet productions lined up to ride that wave of popularity into something more substantial. Instead, it feels like they were so caught off guard by the response that they were constantly trying to play catch-up. You can say what you want about the current state of the MCU, but could you imagine if they had not at least somewhat predicted that people would like, let's say Thor for example, and then we're spending time trying to think of ways to give people more Thor, only for the whole franchise to be at a standstill while they figured something out? Well, it would have been a disaster. This was especially true of the TV show, which came out in 2015. Now, the mockumentary sitcom would come out a year after Most Wanted. But when compared to Muppets 2011, Most Wanted was not nearly as successful. The show is also closer in tone to the 2011 movie than Most Wanted. So in my mind, there's a lot of tonal disconnect between the projects. As a Muppets fan myself, I remember the calls for a new Muppet Show after the 2011 movie happening almost immediately upon release. People wanted more, and that show should have been ready to go. But Disney was just so immensely bad at predicting the zeitgeist of the moment. It's also worth noting that Disney made the choice to move Muppets Most Wanted from the Thanksgiving release weekend that the Muppets 2011 dominated in, and instead elected to release in March against an entry in the Divergent franchise. That might have something to do, though, with Big Hero 6, which Disney released on November 7th, 2014. It's likely that Disney did not want the two movies to cannibalize themselves, as I'm sure Big Hero 6 would become holiday viewing for many families that year. But in my mind, losing that weekend all but sealed the Muppets' theatrical fate, unfortunately. And also a shame about that P. Diddy cameo in Most Wanted too.
Okay, number 5, baby, blow. Come on. There you go. Come on, Diddy Daddy.
Most Wanted indeed. So with the uninspired leadership from Disney at the top, what about the ranks of the Muppet Studios itself? Well, that's a whole mess unto itself. I feel like I might make some people mad with this one, but oh well. A puppet's gotta do what a puppet's gotta do.
No! Yeah, it happens, you know.
And that leads us to point 3, the unwillingness to evolve. In all of my research, one thing about Jim Henson was incredibly clear. He had a very special way of making sure everyone on his team felt important. Whether you are a puppeteer or a PA, your opinion mattered to him. And the ability to do that is the mark of a great leader. But unfortunately, in the years following Jim's passing, something happened. Instead of letting the Muppets evolve with the times, the mission amongst the Muppets' old guard became safeguarding Jim's legacy. The Muppets mean something different to everyone, and with no one to unite everyone's visions, the characters have almost been left in a weird purgatory, where no one can agree on what they're supposed to be. This was very evident during the production of the Muppets 2011, where Muppets' old guard were on the defensive about the project right from the get-go. In an article from The Hollywood Reporter by Kim Masters, a number of people from inside the Muppet camp, many anonymously, get on the movie for so many incredibly petty reasons. Everything from Fozzie wouldn't make a fart joke, to even questioning Jason Segel's motivations for making the movie, and if he even truly knew the characters to begin with. Frank Oz was even more blunt, saying, quote, "I wasn't happy with the script. I don't think they respected the characters, but I don't want to go on about it like a sourpuss and hurt the movie," end quote. And all because Jason Segel wanted to make some changes to these decades-old characters that fit the narrative structure of the story he wanted to tell. And the craziest part is, none of these changes really feel all that drastic. One grievance brought up in the article is that Kermit wouldn't live in a mansion. But an important piece of context that anonymous person left out is that he's not just in the mansion to flaunt his wealth, but so that it can act as a thematic device. The mansion is a home he and Piggy were supposed to share before their breakup, and is filled with memorabilia of his friends. This compels Kermit to reunite the gang, resulting in them coming together. It is run down and forgotten, the same way that, hey, the Muppets were in the movie, and also in the eyes of the audience at the time. By pushing the character outside a perceived comfort zone, Segel and Boban ended up coming up with one of the more recent beautiful and thematically rich moments in the history of the Muppets, with the song Pictures in My Head. This attitude would also extend to the 2015 TV sitcom. Now, this show was fairly controversial at the time. It had a certain edge and drama to it, delving more into the Muppets' everyday lives as employees at a TV studio, where they tried to put on a late-night show starring Miss Piggy as the host. The show is presented in a mockumentary style, a la The Office or Parks and Rec or Modern Family, and explores the relationships of the Muppets while telling a serialized story that progresses week to week. This was an extremely popular format at the time, so it makes sense why it was chosen, as it really played into the collective choice we've all made to treat the Muppets as if they were real people. I love sharing puppet psychosis with everyone, warms the Muppet heart. The characters had to deal with television executives coming for their job, Kermit wrangling his employees, and his inability to relax. But the most controversial plot point of all was a love triangle between Kermit, Miss Piggy, who is now his ex-girlfriend, and Denise, a new female pig character that Kermit is with at the start of the show. I guess Kermit's got a type, and it's bacon. The show was accused of many things: being too mean-spirited, the characters being out of character, how they weren't being zany enough, and many of these critiques would come from the Muppets' old guard themselves. In episode 14 of the series, Kermit's nephew Robin comes to visit. However, Robin's parents have recently separated, and Kermit doesn't want to tell his nephew that he broke up with Miss Piggy, who is basically Robin's surrogate aunt, to not make him feel worse. This leads to a situation where Kermit and Piggy have to feign a relationship for the whole episode before the truth is revealed to Robin. This episode ruffled many feathers, but in particular with Kermit's performer at the time, Steve Whitmire. Side note, remember him. We'll get back to him soon enough. Whitmire declared that Kermit would never lie to Robin like that. He would have just told him the truth and helped guide him through his feelings. The problem there is, then you have no conflict or an episode. It's not like Kermit and Piggy are lying to him out of malice. They're just two confused people trying to protect a kid's feelings who ultimately do come clean and learn something by the end. Hell, Robin is even the one that lays the groundwork for them getting back together, when he tells them they belong together in a way his parents never did. It's honestly one of the best emotional beats of the entire show. Except for when Fozzie was on a dating service looking for bears and he got a different answer. God, I love this show, it's funny.
When your online profile says passionate bear looking for love, you get a lot of wrong responses. Not wrong, just wrong for me.
I bring this all up because this is how this entire show was treated from the start. There was this reluctance from fans and Muppets' old guard to bring the characters into a modern sensibility, to let them change and grow with the times. I think I would understand these complaints more if none of the stories had satisfying emotional conclusions. But they almost all do. You just have to let the narrative play out. The Muppets 2015 would see a mid-series rework to try and get the show more in line with what typical Muppets fare would be, i.e. more individual skits. But it would get canceled not long after. This attitude of what the Muppets should be versus what they could be would reach a fever pitch when Disney eventually fired Steve Whitmire, the puppeteer who took over playing Kermit the Frog after Jim's passing. Steve was initially picked by Brian and Jim Henson to take over many of Jim's roles after his passing, including Kermit and Ernie from Sesame Street. However, in 2017, a Hollywood Reporter article by Ryan Parker would break that Disney would end the decades-long relationship with the performer. At first, it's easy to get angry at Disney over the firing. After all, this is someone who was trained by Jim himself, who had the impossible task of following a legend like no other. But the article itself details accounts from other people involved, including Brian Henson, that starts to paint a very different picture and illustrates the problems with the Muppets that I keep bringing up. The old guard won't let them evolve. After 27 years, people involved in Muppet productions allege that Whitmire exhibited hostile behavior. Many of these situations appear to be disagreements over character motivations, with Whitmire arguing that he knew the character better than the people involved with the productions. And apparently, events like this had been happening for years before this. A follow-up article was published the next day, with Brian Henson stating he should have dismissed Whitmire before selling the Muppets to Disney. He continued that while Whitmire was dedicating to preserving his father's legacy, this would eventually lead to Kermit becoming a very safe and sanitized character, versus having the complexity that his father had imbued him with. A different Hollywood Reporter article by Robert Samelin, published in 2020, says that Whitmire's behavior went so far that when Disney began holding auditions for backup puppeteers to play Kermit, Whitmire went on to blacklist the puppeteers who dared encroach on his territory. In Disney animation, there is a process they call multicasting. They always make sure that there are other voice actors in training to take over characters in the event that the main actor passes away. The process began when Piglet voice actor John Fiedler died, and Disney had no one lined up to take his place. Mostly, it's a preventative measure to keep the production running smoothly. And in the Muppets case, it provides an opportunity to not only have the characters be in multiple places at once for things like promotional events, but also provides a training ground for upcoming puppeteers. Whitmire did not like this. Back when Jim was running things, the characters tended to belong to one person, and one person only. Now, while I understand the apprehension of others coming into your territory, the fact of the matter is that the Muppets are in a very different media landscape now versus then. It behooves them to be in as many places as possible when needed in order to grow their waning popularity. This quote from an anonymous source in the article puts it best, saying, quote, "It was a big part of why they wanted to dismiss him. Disney wanted understudies, period. If Kermit's in New York and also has to be on a cruise ship, you might need a couple of performers if you want this franchise to have a rebirth, because it hasn't happened so far." End quote. The article goes on to state that it's not just Whitmire who may have been holding back the Muppets, but many of the core Muppet players as well, who perform many of the popular characters. This group of 6 dudes, including Matt Vogel, Eric Jacobson, David Goles, Bill Beretta, Peter Lenz, and David Rudman, basically control who's welcomed into the fold, and whose ideas get heard. It really paints a picture of a straight white boys club that is trapped in the past. And you can really feel it in the projects that have come out as of late too. I mean, there was Muppets Now, which was cute, I guess, but almost feels like it was probably better suited for an upload on TikTok or YouTube than Disney+. And then there's Muppet Mayhem, which is about Dr. Teeth and the Electric Mayhem recording their first album. It's a cool concept, but so oddly specific. Like, why is that the Muppets project getting greenlit in this current moment? I love the Electric Mayhem characters, but they're expressly based on a now outdated genre of music. They represent a certain era of pop culture that many audiences today don't exactly have a point of reference for. Now, I'm not saying to never use these characters. I would die if I could never see Animal again. But what I am saying is that if the property is going to survive, we need projects that appeal to today's audiences and that make use of the more timeless aspects of the Muppets. And guess what? The Electric Mayhem isn't that. You want to know why Miss Piggy is so great? Because she will always be able to be relevant. Everyone knows what a pig is. Boom, simple concept. Oh, and she's a fashionista. Put her in what's trendy at the time. She is a classic character built to last. And what about characters that current audiences either grew up with or are more familiar with? Walter from Muppets 2011 and Most Wanted should be a character showing up more. There's a whole generation of people that probably grew up with that character, who haven't had the chance to see him that much since his big debut. The classic characters are amazing. I'm not saying to not give them the spotlight, but if the Muppets are to survive and thrive, they need to be able to evolve, including the performers who love them. And folks, it feels like that's not happening.
That's crazy. No one would watch junk like that.
So at the end of all things, are the Muppets a lost cause? Are they truly on the edge of being ruined? And are cursed to languish in the halls of nostalgia, playing Rainbow Connection on loop? In my honest opinion, no. I don't think so. But it's going to take some open-mindedness from dedicated Muppet fans, elbow grease, and of course, a lot of the mouse's money. For one, I think the Muppet Studio needs to be smarter about the formats and types of Muppet content that they're making moving forward. Pay attention to formats and trends that are popular with today's audiences, and figure out how the Muppets can fit in there. I'm not saying we need to see Miss Piggy declaring it's Brat Summer and doing that apple dance. But for a property that got its start plugging into the cultural zeitgeist, it is baffling how stuck in place it's felt for a while. And to add on to this, Muppets fans, I see you, I love you guys, but stop saying they need to just bring back the Muppet Show in its original form. I love the Muppet Show, but when is the last time you heard someone talk about a variety sketch show that wasn't SNL? And even then, it's almost always to bring up how irrelevant it is nowadays. It's time to move on. But the biggest thing is the Muppet Studio needs new leadership. Leadership whose attention isn't being split between theme parks and the Muppets themselves. The Muppets honestly need their own Kevin Feige. This needs to be someone who loves the Muppets, but is from outside the current Muppet fold. Now, that might sound controversial to some of you, but as I've explained with everything else leading up to this, I think the current crop of people safeguarding the characters are almost chained to the property's legacy in a way that clouds their judgment and ability to evolve the characters. The property needs someone that honors Jim's legacy, but it also needs someone who wants to help the characters, performers, and the studio to grow, and not just preserve Jim's legacy. This would involve Disney having to care a bit more than they do now. So the jury's out on that one. But I truly think with the right creative head running the studio, the Muppets could be poised for another comeback. The world is better with the Muppets in it. Their impact has lingered with old and new fans for decades. Because as harsh as the media landscape can be, people still crave sincere storytelling with a purpose. And that is what Jim Henson and his crew regularly accomplished when given the time and resources to make it happen. Lastly, we also need Disney to actually care about the Muppets. Everyone knows Iger is king of the billion-dollar blockbuster. Why care about those glorified sock puppets when we've got Darth Vader? We have the Avengers. Hell, live-action Sebastian the Crab. And sure, those all may be moneymakers, but the last couple of years, we've seen the disastrous result of spending a ton of money on giant blockbusters, only to see them flop and flop hard. If Disney could open their eyes and see the value in scaled-back, lower-budget projects, I think the Muppets are the perfect property to fill that role. This idea that every project needs to be this billion-dollar-plus success story is quite frankly poison for the movie industry. Folks, I don't want to say the Muppets are hopeless without Jim Henson, but Jim was constantly evolving as a craftsperson, as a performer, as a leader, and as a person. He knew that stagnation was the enemy of progress, and he was always working towards the next great thing. I'd like to think he'd want the Muppets to do the same thing as well. if the powers that be at Disney and the current group of people safeguarding the Muppets could come together and agree on a new vision for the property, I truly think the Muppets could have another renaissance. Every year, I watch a Muppet Christmas Carol, and I am enchanted by the charm and wonder of the Muppets. I know that they are more than just a trend, and they have what it takes to truly succeed as a franchise once again. But Disney needs to give them a fighting chance. Till then, Puppet Saber will sit and wait until he's called upon once again in the defense of the Muppets. But sadly for him, he's gotta wait on the shelf next to the Bob, Larry, and Junior puppets. You know, the ones with the cracked skin that are, I think, cursed. But what do you all think, folks? What can the Muppets do to have a fighting chance in this day and age? Thank you all so much for watching this video. Like it if you like it, leave a comment down below, and I'll see you all next time. Wait, hold on, before we go. One more Kermit arm flail for the road? Ah! God, I love that.
It's time to play the music. It's time to light the light. It's time to meet the Muppets on the Muppet Show tonight.